Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is kind of an introduction of what sociology is. So we'll go into the basics first. So let me make this into a PowerPoint. So this is one of my favorite cartoons, The Sociologists on Strike, Nation in Peril. Sociologists are actually very important to society. And speaking as a sociologist, I can say that, but I hope by the end of this course, you're able to see what value sociologists provide. So what do sociologists do? What do we study and what's interesting to us? The answer is everything, everything, and everything. For example, I've written papers about gay male dating. I've published a paper about genital cancers. I've published papers about diversity in teaching. I've published papers about diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder. I've been all over the map. And so you can really write about anything that interests you in society through a sociological lens. And the lens is the lens of seeing things sociologically. So for example, when I look at bipolar diagnostic criteria, I don't just look at the epidemiology where they say, oh, 25% of people are going to develop bipolar sometimes in their life. Instead, I step back and I look at the sociological aspect of that, which is the human created diagnostic criteria of how we define what bipolar disorder is, or how we define schizophrenia. And we look at the fact that these are not hard and fast biological rules, but they're actually rules that were set up by people and by social groups to define a specific kind of category of person. So that's how we can look at diagnostics from a sociological perspective. So really, sociology, one thing I like about sociology is that we can study anything. We can study marriage from a sociological perspective. And so that's really exciting to me about sociology. So sociology is a scientific study of human and social lives, groups, and societies. And it's a study of our own behaviors as social beings. So you can look at a behavior as as an individual psychological behavior. Like, let's say you have a behavior of, I don't know, self-harming, for example, people who cut themselves or hurt themselves in some way. So you could say psychologically, this is why this person is doing that. But you also could say sociologically, what is it in the culture that has driven this person to do that? Or what is it in their own little social group, in their marriage, in their family, in their friend group that has led them to do this? So we can study things psychologically, sociologically, economically. There's a lot of different ways we can look at a specific concept. So sociology is a scientific way of thinking about society and its influence on human groups. We use a scientific method. And I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with the scientific method. And so we use a scientific method, and a lot of times people will say, oh, sociology isn't real science because it's not a hard science. But we do use the scientific method, and we use it to apply to society and its influence on groups. So we view human behavior in a societal context because it reveals the underlying basis for many social issues, problems, and current events. So I mentioned psychology, but sometimes there's confusion about what other social sciences cover and what sociology covers. So psychology studies the individual. So going back to my example of someone who self-harms or who cuts themselves, they would study what is going on in this individual's inner life to lead them to cut or so self-harm. Now, anthropology studies culture more broadly. Now, historically, anthropology has studied so-called foreign cultures, but today anthropologists go and study cultures that are similar to their own. So political science, as I said, studies the political and economics studies the economy. It is important to note, though, that sociology can study all of these things as well. So we have a subdiscipline called social psychology, which looks at the social engagement of individuals. We have certainly cultural sociology, political sociology, and economic sociology. So what is the social? I keep talking about the social. The social is everywhere. It's in between the individual and the number of people on this planet is the social. So I can study a dyad, which is a group of 2 people. I can study a triad, which is a group of 3 people, or I can study the entire world. Usually sociology fits somewhere in between those 2 extremes. Most sociologists do not study the entire world, but they may do a comparison study between 2 or 3 nations, for example. So they may look at, I was looking at a study that looked at the trust in science across 22 different nations. So you could definitely have nationwide comparisons. You can have, but usually sociology is somewhere in between multi-nation studies and individual level studies. So the task of sociology is to use a sociological perspective to understand how issues are shaped by the social structure. So it's the organized pattern of relationships and institutions that make up society. So it's important to realize that society is patterned in certain ways. And we use institutions, which I'll get into later. We use institutions to examine how institutions impact society. And by institutions, I don't mean just businesses or the banking system or the education system, but also institutions are more informal institutions, such as the institution of marriage or the institution of, I'm a medical and psychiatric sociologist, so the institution of healthcare. We use the sociological imagination to use a process of debunking to question actions and ideas that are usually taken for granted. So this is really important. So for example, I often talk about the institution of marriage. And in Western society, we examine the love marriage as being the most important kind of marriage, but we also assume that all marriages are based on love, or originally based on love, even if they don't end on love, but that people get married because of love. And the truth is, if you look societally across other nations and across other time periods, love marriage is a relatively new phenomenon. And in some countries, they still don't have love marriages. They have arranged marriages that are based on property, based on joining families together. And the concept of a love marriage is very much a Western recent idea. So that's an idea that we usually take for granted, but it's actually not true. So one of the things that I do as a sociologist is to take things that are taken for granted and say, how do social institutions impact this? So we have a concept called reification, and reification is a concept that we take a natural phenomenon and assume that it has a natural history when really it has a social history. So we look behind the facades of everyday life to unmask the patterns that shape unobserved behavior. So if you have time in the course of this class, I highly recommend that you look up a sociologist called C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills. He wrote an astounding book called The Sociological Imagination. And the sociological imagination is basically a treatise on what sociology is and how we can use our sociological imagination to tap into sociological questions. So we understand personal changes, opinions, and situations. We must look beyond the individual to structural and institutional changes. So, for example, a personal problem may be that I don't have health insurance because let's say I lost my job and I don't have health insurance. That's a personal problem. But the social problem is that we don't have generalized universal health care in the United States. We don't have a good Medicaid system. We don't have a safety social net. And so the personal problem is linked to the societal problem. Another example could be that a person is suffering from problems in their marriage. Now, it feels like a very personal issue, but the social issue may be that we don't provide good marriage counseling in this society. We don't have a lot of social support. Once you get married, you fall into a cocoon of you and your partner, and you don't have good social support or social networks to support you in your marriage. So those could be social issues or personal issues that turn into social issues. So I encourage you to look around you and say, what looks like a personal problem, and how can I use my sociological imagination to turn it into a social problem? So C. Wright Mills provides us with some good questions that we must ask ourselves in order to do good research. What's the structure of society? Where does the society stand in human history? And what type of actors are in the society?